Beneath the most beautiful rose bushes in Philadelphia, two skeletons were smiling. I know because I dug them up. And the man who planted those roses was the man I was supposed to marry in 3 weeks. What I did next would send me 2,000 miles west into the arms of three strangers and into the deadliest winter Montana had ever seen. This is the story of the Bride of Dead Man's Canyon. Beneath the most beautiful rose bushes in Philadelphia, two skeletons were smiling. I know because I dug them up. And the man who planted those roses was the man I was supposed to marry in 3 weeks. That is what Clara May Whitfield carried in her chest the night she ran. Not a suitcase, not a plan, not a prayer. Just the memory of bone grinning up at her from the dark earth and the weight of a leather journal pressed against her ribs beneath her coat, its pages filled with the careful handwriting of a man who documented his murders the way other men documented their harvests. She ran through the garden first, past the rose beds, past the east wall where the first wife lay, past the west wall where the second wife lay, through the iron gate that Judge Harmon Ashford kept oiled because he was a man who believed in the appearance of things and appearances required silence, and silence required well-oiled hinges. The October air tasted of dying leaves and rain-soaked earth. Clara's boots hit the cobblestones in a rhythm that matched her heart. Behind her, windows began to glow as lamps were lit one by one through the Ashford mansion, each light another eye-opening, another moment closer to discovery. She did not look back. But to understand why Clara ran, you need to understand what she found. And to understand what she found, you need to go back 3 weeks to a Tuesday afternoon in early October, when the sky hung low and gray over Philadelphia, and a young woman knelt in a garden with a shovel, and no idea that the next thing she touched would change the course of her life forever. Clara May Whitfield was 22 years old, honey blonde hair that caught light even on cloudy days, cornflower blue eyes set in a heart-shaped face that people called delicate, but that held more iron than most men's fists. She was the daughter of a school teacher named Arthur Whitfield, a man who loved books the way some men loved horses, completely and without apology. He had taught her Latin before she turned 10, French by 12. He had moved the family from a small farm in rural Pennsylvania to a row house in Philadelphia when Clara was 15, trading open fields for a teaching position and filling every room with more volumes than furniture. Clara had grown up believing that knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you. She was wrong about that, but she would not learn how wrong for several months yet. Arthur Whitfield died of consumption in the spring of 1887. He left behind a wife, a daughter, debts that swallowed every stick of furniture and every beloved book in a silence so total that it seemed to press the walls inward. Clara's mother, Helen, a woman whose beauty had always been her currency and whose grief made her reckless with it, accepted Judge Harmon Ashford's proposal of marriage within 6 weeks of the funeral. The judge was 58, wealthy, respected, a pillar of Philadelphia society with a jaw like a granite shelf and eyes that calculated the value of everything they touched. He cleared Arthur's debts. He moved Helen into the mansion on Chestnut Hill. And in a gesture that he presented as generosity, but that Clara understood immediately as transaction, he offered his son, Vincent, as a husband for Clara. Vincent Ashford was 28, tall, thin, clean-shaved with a narrow face and dark eyes that never quite settled on anything long enough to warm it. He dressed in suits that cost more than most men earned in 3 months. He smiled often. The smile never reached his eyes. It sat on his mouth like something placed there by careful hands, a decoration rather than an expression. Clara did not want to marry Vincent Ashford. But Clara did not have a choice. Her mother was already living in the judge's house. The debts were cleared on the condition of the marriage. To refuse was to throw her mother back into poverty, back into the silence that had nearly consumed her after Arthur died. Clara understood the arithmetic of desperation. She had watched her father teach mathematics. She knew when an equation had only one solution. So she said yes, and she spent the weeks before the wedding doing what the Ashford household expected of her. She helped plan the reception. She was fitted for a dress. She smiled at Vincent across dinner tables and pretended not to notice the way his hands sometimes closed around her wrist with a pressure that left marks she covered with long sleeves. And on that Tuesday in October, she went to the garden to dig up rose bushes. The shovel hit something hard, not a rock, something that gave slightly under pressure, then cracked. Clara brushed away soil with her fingers, working carefully the way her father had taught her to handle fragile things. A skull looked up at her from the earth. Its jaw hung slightly open. The eye sockets were empty and dark and seemed to stare with a patience that only the dead possess. Around the cervical vertebrae, a delicate gold chain, a locket still clasped. Clara opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, a tiny photograph, a woman's face. Young, hopeful, wearing a wedding dress. Clara did not scream. She did not cry. She did not run. Instead, she kept digging, her breath coming in shallow pulls, her hands steady despite the trembling that had started somewhere deep inside her chest. Below the first skeleton, she found a second. This one wore a silver ring on the bone of her left hand. An inscription caught the fading afternoon light. To Margaret, with eternal love. V. of Vincent Ashford. Clara sat back on her heels in the dirt and looked at the two sets of remains and understood with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins that she was looking at the women who had married Vincent before her. She understood that the roses bloomed so well in this garden because of what fed them. She understood that the judge who cleared her father's debts and the son who smiled without warmth were not saviors. They were gravediggers, and she was meant to be the third body beneath the roses. Clara replaced the soil, carefully, precisely, patted it down so that no one would know it had been disturbed. She stood, brushed the dirt from her dress, and walked into the house with a face so composed that Helen smiled at her from the parlor and said she looked lovely. That night, Clara searched the library. She found it behind a leather-bound edition of Dante's Inferno, a thin notebook, Vincent's precise handwriting filling every page. She left muddy fingerprints on the cover as she opened it. The first entry was dated 3 years prior. Wife number 1 would not stop crying after discovering my particular tastes. I tried to be patient, but her constant weeping became insufferable. Father helped me dig the hole in the east garden beneath where Mother's roses used to grow. We planted new roses the next day. They bloomed beautifully that spring, fed by what lay beneath. Clara pressed her hand to her mouth. The second entry dated 18 months ago. Margaret was more resilient than the first. She lasted nearly a year before threatening to go to the authorities about what she had seen in the cellar. I could not allow that. Father suggested the west garden this time. The roses there needed fertilizing anyway. I am becoming quite good at this. And then the line that stopped Clara's heart. The third one will need to be more carefully chosen. Someone with no family to ask questions. Someone desperate. Clara closed the journal, held it against her chest. And in that moment, standing in the library of a house built on bones, she made the first real decision of her adult life. She would not become wife number 3. She would not lie beneath roses. She would find a way out or she would die trying. But she would not die quietly. The advertisement was tucked in the back pages of a 6-month-old newspaper she had been using to press wildflowers. She had noticed it weeks ago and thought it peculiar, even amusing. Now she read it with different eyes. 3 brothers seeking 1 wife. We are identical triplets, age 34 mountain ranchers in Montana Territory. We seek 1 woman of strong character, willing heart, and honest spirit. Must accept life in remote mountain country. We offer protection, provision, and a home. Respond to Calhoun Dead Man's Canyon, care of Silver Creek Post Office. 3 brothers, 1 wife. Montana Territory, 2,000 miles from Philadelphia. 2,000 miles from the garden and the bones and the man who would bury her there. Clara sat at her writing desk that night and composed a letter by candlelight. She wrote carefully, each word chosen the way her father had taught her to choose words with precision and honesty. Dear Mr. Calhoun, I am Clara May Whitfield. 22 years of age, educated, healthy, and in circumstances I cannot fully describe in a letter. I bring no dowry save my education, my willingness to work, and the truth that I am running from something far worse than the unknown. If you find me acceptable, I can arrive by December. I have nowhere else to go. That last line, she stared at it for a long time. It read like surrender. But Clara meant it as a battle cry. She sealed the letter and mailed it the next morning. Then she waited. And every day she waited, she sat across from Vincent Ashford at dinner and smiled and nodded and felt the bones beneath the roses calling to her through the floorboards like a warning she could not unhear. 3 weeks passed. The reply came on a gray November morning, postmarked Silver Creek, Montana Territory. Clara's hands shook so badly she could barely open the envelope. The letter was brief, written in a bold, slanting hand. Miss Whitfield, we are direct men. You will be wife by law to one and by honor to all three. We are not gentlemen, but we are honorable. We will protect you with our lives. If this arrangement does not suit you, do not come. If it does arrive, Silver Creek by December 10th. Choose wisely. Silas Calhoun. Clara read it 7 times. She traced the handwriting with her fingertip. The letters were rough and angular and carried the weight of a man who did not waste words. There was no poetry in them, no charm, no false promise, just a plain statement of terms offered by a man who expected to be taken at his word. She had 14 days. The wedding with Vincent was 4 days away. She needed a reason to delay. Clara told Helen she was feeling unwell. Headaches, dizziness, a woman's complaint that did not require elaboration. Helen fretted. Judge Ashford agreed to postpone the ceremony until early December. A sickly bride, he said, would not photograph well. Vincent said nothing, but his dark eyes followed Clara through the house with an attention that made her skin crawl, the gaze of a predator who suspects his prey has sensed the trap. 3 weeks of pretending, 3 weeks of memorizing the combination to the judge's safe. 18 right, 4 left, 29 right. Her father's death date, the judge considered himself sentimental. Clara considered him predictable. 3 weeks of hiding the journal in her trunk beneath 3 dresses and 2 nightgowns, and a Bible her father had given her on her 16th birthday. On the night of December 3rd, Clara opened the safe. Inside, she found stacks of bills, legal documents, and a leather pouch of gold coins. She took $200, the exact amount her father's estate would have been worth before the judge's legal manipulations absorbed it into his own holdings. Not theft, recovery. She also took her mother's wedding ring from her first marriage, her grandmother's before that. 3 generations of women who had actually chosen their husbands. The judge had claimed it as payment toward the debts. Clara took it back. She left a note for Helen. Brief, loving, deliberately vague. Do not worry, do not search. I am safe. I love you. Forgive me. Then she walked out of the Ashford mansion with one small trunk, the journal pressed against her ribs, and the knowledge that if she was caught, she would be the 3rd set of bones beneath roses that bloomed too red in spring. The train station was 4 blocks away. She made it in 3 minutes. The 5:15 morning express to Chicago departed in 20 minutes. From Chicago, she would transfer to the Union Pacific line heading west. 6 days to Silver Creek. 6 days between her old life and whatever waited at the end of the rail. Clara bought her ticket with cash, sat in the 3rd car, pressed her face to the window, and watched Philadelphia shrink behind her, its brick and cobblestone and church spires dissolving into the gray morning like a city made of smoke. She did not cry. She had used up her tears on the night she found the bones. What remained was something harder than grief and colder than fear. It was the clarity of a woman who has seen the worst that can happen and decided she will not let it. Somewhere behind her, Vincent Ashford was waking up. Somewhere behind her, the garden kept its secrets. Somewhere behind her, a judge was pouring his morning coffee with the steady hand of a man who had helped bury 2 women and was prepared to bury a 3rd. But Clara was no longer behind her. Clara was moving west, and she was not looking back. On the 2nd day of the journey, a woman sat down across from her in the dining car and introduced herself as Margaret Bridwell. She was 55, solid as a fence post, with gray-streaked hair pulled tight and hands roughened by decades of work. Her eyes were the kind that missed nothing and judged slowly. "Where are you headed, dear Silver Creek?" Clara said. "Montana Territory. I am to be married there." Margaret's eyebrows rose but did not climb far. "Rancher 3 ranchers," Clara said. "Brothers." She did not know why she told the truth. Perhaps because Margaret's eyes were kind, in a way that Clara had not seen in months. Perhaps because she desperately needed one person in the world to know where she was going and why. Margaret studied her for a long moment. Then she leaned forward and spoke in a voice that was low and practical and carried no judgment at all. "The Calhoun boys. I know of them. They have been up in Dead Man's Canyon since they were boys. Their mother raised them there alone. She was killed about 6 years back. Hollister's doing everyone knows, but nobody could prove it. After that, the brothers mostly stopped coming to town. Keep to themselves, hard men, but honest. Fair dealers. Never cheated anyone at the trading post. Clara asked the question that mattered. Are they good men? Margaret considered this the way a woman considers the weather before hanging laundry. They are not easy men, she said. Living with three brothers in a mountain cabin is not a church social, but I have never heard of them raising a hand in anger to anyone who did not earn it. And I have heard of them twice riding 20 miles in snow to help a neighbor whose cattle broke through ice. That tells you something about the shape of their character. Clara told Margaret everything. The bones, the journal, the garden. Vincent. By the time she finished, Margaret's face had gone pale. Sweet, merciful heaven, Margaret breathed. You are running for your life. Yes. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Clara's hand with a grip that could crack walnuts. Listen to me. If things go wrong up in that canyon, if those brothers turn out to be anything other than what they seem, you come to me. Margaret Bridwell, Main Street, Silver Creek, the only three-story building in town. Clara could not speak for a moment. She nodded. That was enough. They talked for hours after that. Margaret told her about Montana winters that could kill 6 different ways before breakfast, about the kind of cold that found your bones and settled there like a tenant who refused to leave, about the silence of mountains that stretched so wide and so empty that some women went mad from it. Clara listened. She was not afraid of silence. She had lived inside the Ashford mansion, where silence was a weapon, where the absence of sound meant someone was watching and waiting and planning. Montana silence, she thought, could not be worse than Philadelphia silence. At least in Montana, the things trying to kill you had the decency to announce themselves. On the 6th day, the train pulled into Silver Creek. Clara stepped onto the platform with her trunk and her journal and the last of her courage and looked at the town that would either save her or finish what Vincent Ashford had started. Silver Creek was smaller than she had imagined. One main street of packed dirt lined with wooden buildings that leaned into each other for support. Mountains in every direction, their peaks already heavy with snow. The air was thin and clean and so cold it burned her lungs with each breath. Margaret helped with the trunk. The post office is just there, she said, pointing. Let them know you have arrived. The clerk's face brightened when Clara gave her name. Miss Whitfield, the Calhoun brothers, have been checking daily. They are out at the livery stable preparing the wagon. Clara walked to the livery stable with Margaret beside her. The building smelled of hay and horse and leather and the particular warmth that comes from large animals in an enclosed space. Sunlight cut through the open doors and long golden columns filled with dust. Then she saw them. 3 men stood in a line near a wagon. For a moment, Clara's mind could not process what her eyes were showing her. They were identical. Not similar, not resembling. Identical. The same height, easily 6'7" towers of bone and muscle that blocked the sunlight like 3 columns carved from the same mountain. The same chestnut brown hair as though one wore his slightly longer. The same amber eyes that caught the stable light and turned it to fire. They had been splitting wood. Shirts rolled to the elbows, forearms thick with muscle and rope burn scars and the particular tan that comes from years of outdoor labor. Their hands were enormous, calloused, scarred across the knuckles from work that did not forgive hesitation. But they were not the same, not exactly. And Clara, who had learned to read men the way her father had taught her to read books, saw the differences immediately. The one who set down his axe and stepped forward moved with authority, not arrogance. The quiet certainty of a man who has been responsible for others long enough that leadership has sunk into his bones. His face was stern, deeply lined, though he could not have been older than 35. A thin scar ran along his jaw from ear to chin. His eyes held a tiredness that did not come from the trail. The second one stood slightly behind. Same face but different expression. Gentler. His eyes moved from Clara's face to her hands to the trunk she carried, assessing not with suspicion, but with the careful attention of someone accustomed to diagnosing what was wrong and fixing it. A puckered scar marked his left shoulder, visible through his open collar. His hands, though just as large as his brother's, moved with a softness that seemed borrowed from a different man entirely. The third leaned against the wagon with his arms crossed and a grin on his face that looked like it lived there permanently. Same height, same shoulders, same amber eyes, but something playful behind them that the other 2 lacked. Mischief, maybe. Or the particular brand of humor that belongs to men who have decided that if the world insists on being difficult, The least they can do is laugh at it. And behind the third brother's legs, half hidden, peering out at Clara with enormous brown eyes set in a face that was too thin and too serious for its age, stood a boy. 7 years old, maybe. Hair the color of mud after rain. Clothes that were clean but too large, as if someone had bought them with growing room in mind, and the boy had not yet grown into the expectation. The first brother stepped forward. Miss Whitfield. His voice was deep and rough, like gravel being turned by a river. Clara extended her hand. It disappeared completely inside his when he took it. His palm was warm and hard, and he held her fingers with a care that seemed at odds with the obvious strength behind it. I am Silas. These are my brothers. Levi. Boone. Boone, the grinning one, touched the brim of his hat. Do not let him scare you, ma'am. We are civilized, mostly. Levi, the gentle one, inclined his head. Welcome, Miss Whitfield. Margaret arranged a room for you at her boarding house tonight. You are safe here. Clara heard herself say the first words she would speak to these men, and later she would think about how those words defined everything that came after. I am not going back. I made a promise. Silas studied her face. The stern lines around his mouth did not soften, but something shifted behind his eyes. A recognition, as if she had spoken a language he understood, but had not heard in a very long time. Clara knelt down to the level of the boy, still hiding behind Boone's legs. His eyes tracked her movement, the way a rabbit watches a hawk ready to bolt. What is your name? The boy did not answer. He looked up at Boone. Boone's grin gentled. This is Wren. Found him on the trail 2 winters ago. Parents died of fever. He does not talk much. Clara looked at the boy. She saw herself. But before the witnesses gathered here, and in the eyes of the Lord, we join this woman to these men. Silas explained the arrangement in the plain terms that Clara was already learning, characterized everything he said. The law recognizes one marriage. I will sign the certificate. But before God and this community, you are bound to all 3 of us by honor, not as property, as family. The vows came one at a time. Silas went first. I vow to protect you with my life, to provide for you, to honor you. Short, hard. Each word placed like a stone in a wall meant to stand for 100 years. Levi spoke next. I vow to heal you when you are hurt, to hold steady when you are scared, to treat you with the gentleness you deserve. His voice was low and even like water over smooth stones, and Clara felt something inside her unclench for the first time in months. Boone grinned, but when he spoke, the grin faded into something real and raw. I vow to make you smile even when the world is dark, to remind you that laughter is not weakness. And the way he said it, with a crack in his voice that he did not bother to hide, told Clara that this man used humor the way other men used armor, to keep the world from seeing what lived underneath. Clara spoke last. Her voice did not waver. I vow to stand with you, to trust you with my heart, to build a home worthy of the name, and to never stop fighting for this family. Reverend Whitley pronounced them married. You may greet your bride, he said. Silas solved the question of who went first by taking Clara's hands in both of his enormous palms swallowing her fingers completely. He leaned down and Clara braced for a kiss on the mouth. Instead, he pressed his lips to her forehead. Gently, reverently. The gesture of a man who understood that respect was a better foundation than desire. Levi squeezed her hand once firmly, the way a man seals a promise. Boone winked and executed a bow so old-fashioned and so sincere that Margaret Bridwell burst into tears from the second pew. Wren stood in the back of the chapel beside Margaret, watching everything with eyes that were decades too old for his 7-year-old face. He held Margaret's hand, but his gaze never left Clara. That afternoon, they loaded into the wagon for the 6-hour ride to Dead Man's Canyon. Silas drove. Clara sat between him and Levi. Boone rode in the back with Wren, who had fallen asleep against Boone's shoulder within the first mile. The road narrowed as they climbed. The trees thickened. Mountains rose blue and heavy on every side. Snow dusted the peaks and the air thinned and sharpened until each breath felt like swallowing glass. Boone pointed out landmarks as they rode. That ridge is where the elk come down in November. That creek freezes solid by Christmas but runs clean all spring. That stand of pine is where we cut firewood. His voice was easy and warm, filling the silence the way lantern light fills a dark room. Silas said nothing. He drove. But Clara noticed that he adjusted the reins so that the roughest ruts hit his side of the wagon instead of hers. He noticed things. He adjusted. He did not announce what he did. He simply did it. And Clara, who had spent months living with a man whose courtesy was a mask for violence, felt the difference in her bones. The cabin appeared as the sun touched the ridgeline and set the snow on fire. It was tucked against the shoulder of a hill where the wind lost its edge. Larger than Clara had expected, solid log walls, a roof patched with new shingles on the south side, a chimney that stood straight and true, smoke curling from the stovepipe like a signal. "That is it," Silas said. Clara stared. It did not look like safety. It looked like a question. But it also looked like the first real thing she had seen in months. No polish, no pretense. Just a building made of wood and stone and honest labor standing where someone had decided to stand and refusing to fall down. Inside the cabin was warm and cleaner than Clara expected from three men living alone. One large room with a loft above, a stone fireplace that dominated the west wall, a table with four chairs, each one built by hand, the joints tight, the wood sanded smooth, shelves lined with books. Clara's eyes went to them immediately. Moby Dick, Shakespeare, a volume of frontier botany, medical texts. She looked at Levi, who met her gaze with something that might have been embarrassment. "I read," he said simply. In the corner, a smaller space, a low cot sized for a child, a shelf with carved wooden animals, a bear, a horse, a bird with outspread wings, each one shaped with the patient detail of hands that had nothing but time and care. "Boone made those," Levi said. "He whittles when he cannot sleep, which is most nights." Silas showed Clara to a room at the back of the cabin. Private, a single bed, a washstand, a window that faced the creek, a door with a bolt that locked from the inside. "You sleep in here," he said. "Private, locked from inside. We bunk in the main room. That is how it will be until you say otherwise." Clara understood what he was telling her. There was no expectation, no schedule, no demand. She had a door and a lock and the right to use both. She wanted to say something, something that matched the weight of what he was offering. Instead, she said only, "Thank you." He nodded once and left. The door closed softly behind him. That night, after the household went quiet and the fire burned low, and the only sounds were the wind against the roof and the distant murmur of the creek, Clara knelt beside the bed and reached beneath it. Her fingers touched metal, a tin box, small, pushed deep into the shadows. She pulled it into the lamplight and opened it. Inside, she found a photograph creased at the corners and faded with handling. A woman standing with three boys. She was thin and weathered, her dress plain, her hair pulled back. But her eyes were bright, fierce, even with the particular light of someone who has decided that stubbornness is a form of prayer. The boys were teenagers, lanky and sun-browned, already tall, already carrying themselves with the particular seriousness of children who have been asked to be adults before their time. On the back, in a feminine hand, Rose and her boys. Spring 1868. Rose Calhoun, their mother. Beneath the photograph, pressed into the corner of the tin, Clara found something else. A scrap of paper folded into a tight square. The handwriting was feminine and faded, the ink nearly gone, the paper soft from being handled many times. Clara unfolded it carefully. She read the first line and stopped breathing. "My boys, if I am gone when you read this, protect each other. Build something worth keeping. Let someone in. Your mother loved hard and lived well, and I want the same for you, Rose." Clara held the letter in the lamplight. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it back into its tight square and placed it in her coat pocket next to the journal. She did not put it back in the box. She would carry it until the right moment came to give it to the man who needed it most. She placed the photograph back exactly as she had found it. She did not ask about Rose. Not that night. She had learned that some truths come when they are ready, and pulling at them too early only tears the fabric. She lay down and listened to the silence of the mountains. It was different from Philadelphia silence. No threat in it, no calculation. Just the vast indifference of a wilderness that did not know her name and did not care about her past and would kill her just as readily as it would shelter her, depending on whether she had the sense to come in from the cold. Through the wall, she heard Boone's voice, low and murmuring, telling Wren a story. The words were too soft to make out, but the rhythm was steady and gentle, the cadence of a man who had done this many times and never tired of it. Then she heard something else, a small sound, so brief she almost missed it. A child's laugh. Ren, the boy who did not talk much, laughing at a story told by a man whose own laughter hid a wound he would not show. Clara closed her eyes and felt for the first time since her father died that she might be somewhere worth staying. In the morning, she burned the porridge. The coffee came out thick enough to stand a spoon in. She stood at the stove with her face hot from embarrassment and from the cast iron, and waited for the criticism she had learned to expect from every meal she had ever failed to prepare perfectly in the Ashford household. Boone ate his entire bowl of scorched porridge without comment, licked the spoon, reached for more. Levi drank the coffee and only winced slightly in a way that could have been the heat rather than the taste. Silas looked at her across the table. His face gave nothing away. "Tomorrow will be better," he said. Not praise, not criticism, just fact. Clara decided she could work with a man who dealt in facts. The days that followed taught Clara things that no Philadelphia education could have prepared her for. She learned that water from the creek had to be carried in buckets that weighed more than she expected. She learned this by slipping on a rock the second morning and spilling the entire load down the bank. She sat in the mud with her pride soaking into the earth and her arms aching, and felt every mile of the 2,000 she had traveled pressing down on her shoulders. Then she saw Ren. The boy was sitting on a rock by the creek watching her. He stood without a word, picked up a small tin cup, filled it from the creek, and carried it over and set it on the ground beside her. Then he sat back down on his rock and watched the water move. It was not much, a cup of water from a child who did not speak. But Clara understood what it meant. It meant I see you. It meant I know what it is like to fall. It meant you are not alone here, even if neither of us knows how to say it yet. On the third day, a rider came. Not family, a lean man with sun-cracked lips and a squint that had been skeptical long before it became permanent. He introduced himself as Clem Hadley, said he worked for Silas during the busy seasons. He looked at Clara and Ren with open suspicion. "You brought home a woman and you have got that stray boy. More mouths to feed in the middle of winter coming on. What are you thinking?" He did not lower his voice, did not seem to think he needed to. Silas said nothing, just looked at Clem and kept looking until the man went quiet. Clara felt the judgment settle over her like a coat she had not asked to wear. She had felt it before. In Philadelphia after her father died. In every town she had passed through. The look that said, "What kind of woman ends up like this?" She said nothing. She had learned that work answered questions better than words. So she worked. She mended a tear in the horse blanket with stitches so fine they disappeared into the fabric. She organized the root cellar, separating the good potatoes from the ones starting to sprout. She scrubbed the cabin floor on her hands and knees until the boards showed their grain. She cooked better the second day, and better still the third. By the fifth day, Boone told her that her biscuits were the best thing he had eaten since his mother was alive. And then he went quiet and looked at the fire, and Clara understood that she had just received the highest compliment this household could offer. The storm came on the fifth night. Not a blizzard yet, but a hard wind that screamed through the valley and shook the cabin walls. Silas and Clem had ridden out at dawn to check the cattle at the far pasture. They had not returned by dark. Clara heard the cattle lowing, then the creak of broken fence posts, then the thud of hooves on soft ground. The cows were getting out. She looked at Ren. The boy sat at the table with a piece of bread and a carved wooden horse, his eyes already on her, already reading the decision before she made it. "Stay inside," she said. "Watch the fire." She pulled on Silas's spare coat, which hung past her knees, and swallowed her hands. She grabbed the hammer and the coil of wire from the lean-to and walked out into the dark. It took her 2 hours. The wire cut her palms. The wind knocked her flat twice. She worked by lantern light, driving stakes and twisting wire with fingers that went numb before she finished the first post. Blood ran down her wrists and dripped onto the snow and froze there in dark circles that looked like flowers. Halfway through, the cabin door opened. Ren appeared. He carried the second lantern in both hands, holding it high and steady the way a surgeon's assistant holds a retractor. 7 years old, skinny as a fence rail, jaw set. He did not speak. He did not need to. He stood beside Clara and held the light and did not flinch when the wind screamed and the wire sang and the dark pressed in from every side. By dawn, the fence held, not perfect, but enough. When Silas and Clem rode in at first light, both of them mud-splattered and grim from a night chasing strays, they found Clara sitting on the porch step with raw hands and a face white with exhaustion. Wren sat beside her, the lantern still in his lap, asleep with his head against her shoulder. Silas looked at the fence, looked at Clara's hands, looked at her face, looked at Wren asleep against her side. He did not say thank you, did not say well done, did not say a single word of praise. He nodded. One nod, slow and deep. And that nod carried more weight than any words Clara had heard in years. Clem Hadley stood behind Silas, looking at the fence, then at Clara, then at the fence again. His squint had changed. The skepticism had not vanished, but it had cracked. Light was getting through. "You know wire work?" he asked. "I grew up on a farm," Clara said. Clem said nothing more. But that night he ate 2 bowls of her stew and did not complain about a single thing. Later, after the children and the men had settled and the fire crackled low, Clara sat on the porch in the cold and looked at the stars. They were brighter here than anything she had seen in Philadelphia. Hard and white and endless, scattered across the sky like salt thrown on dark cloth. She heard the door open behind her. Silas sat down beside her without asking permission. He was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that has weight, the kind that builds towards something. "Why did you answer my letter?" Clara asked. "Out of every woman who could have written, why me?" He was whittling a piece of pine. His knife moved in small, certain strokes. He did not look up. "You sounded like someone who had done everything she could," he said, "and it still was not enough." Clara's throat closed. She turned toward the stars so he would not see. More silence. The creek murmured below the ridge. An owl called from somewhere in the pines. "Why me?" she asked again. A different question this time, though the words were the same. "Out of everyone on every road in Montana, why did you stop and answer?" He was quiet for so long, she thought he would not respond. Then he spoke, and his voice had the quality of something that had been kept in a locked room for years and was only now seeing light. "You sounded like someone who deserved to have somebody stay." The distance between them was the width of a fist. Clara could feel the warmth of him through the frozen air. She reached out and took his hand. Rough on rough. Callous on callous. The hands of 2 people who had spent their lives holding things that were trying to slip away. He let her, and they sat like that in the dark, holding on while the stars burned cold above them, and the mountains stood silent around them, and the sound of Wren's breathing drifted through the cabin wall like a small, steady proof that life goes on even when you have stopped expecting it to. Clara did not know how many more nights they would sit this way before the silence between them became a language. She did not know that the next sound to break it would be hooves on the road and a voice that would turn everything she had built in these few days to ash. But for now, this was enough. A porch, a hand, a sky full of stars. And the knowledge that somewhere beneath her in the tin box under the bed, a woman named Rose smiled out of a photograph at 3 boys she had raised alone in this cabin on this mountain, and who had grown into men strong enough to open the door for a stranger and gentle enough to carve wooden horses for a child who could not speak. Clara held Silas's hand. The wind moved through the valley. The fire crackled behind them. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was not afraid of what morning would bring. Winter came to the Montana Territory the way trouble comes to good people. Slowly at first, then all at once, the first hard frost painted the cabin windows white by the 2nd week of December. By the 3rd, the creek ran sluggish and cold, and ice formed along its edges in thin sheets that cracked under the weight of a drinking cup. Silas stacked firewood higher each day, cutting and hauling from the stand of pine on the north slope, building a wall of split logs along the side of the cabin that grew taller than Clara's head. He moved with the steady urgency of a man who had survived enough winters to know what was coming and refused to be caught short again. Clara learned the rhythms. Which draft to close at midnight and which to crack at dawn. The sound the chimney made when the wind shifted north, a low moan like a sick animal, and how to adjust the flue before the smoke backed up and filled the room. She learned to keep the stove burning through the long, dark hours without choking it or letting it die. And she learned that this particular skill, this patience with fire, was the difference between a bearable night and a miserable one. Wren made a game of finding the warmest spot in the cabin. usually the corner where sunlight hit the floor for 1 hour at midday. A golden square that moved like a slow clock across the boards. The boy would sit in it with his carved wooden horse and let the warmth travel across his face, and for those few minutes, the cold seemed like something that happened to other people in other places. But there was a cold inside Clara that had nothing to do with weather. She noticed things about the brothers in these quiet days. The way each of them carried their grief differently, like three men carrying the same stone, but gripping it in different places. Silas carried his in his jaw. It tightened when he passed the spot by the stove where Rose had been found. He never stood on that exact square of floor. He walked around it the way a man walks around a grave, with respect and distance and the knowledge that looking directly at it would cost more than he could afford. Levi carried his in his hands. He was always touching things, checking them, repairing them. He mended fences that did not need mending and oiled hinges that already swung smooth. He had turned healing into a form of penance, as if by fixing enough broken things in the world, he could retroactively fix the one thing that had broken beyond repair, the night he walked through the cabin door and found his mother on the floor. And Boone carried his in his smile. Claire understood this now. The grin that never left his face was not joy. It was architecture. A load-bearing wall built to hold back 6 years of unprocessed grief. Every joke was a brick, every wink was mortar. And the structure was magnificent and terrifying, because Clara could see the cracks in it, hairline fractures that showed when he thought no one was watching, when he sat alone on the porch at night, and the grin slipped, and what was underneath looked like a man drowning in a room with no water. She needed supplies, flour, salt, thread for mending, lard if she could get it. More importantly, she needed to see the town. She needed to understand the shape of the world she had married into, the allies and the enemies, the ground she would have to defend. Silas offered to go alone. Clara shook her head. "I need to see it for myself," she said. "I need to know what we are dealing with." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. Levi drove the wagon. Clara sat beside him with Wren between them. The boy bundled in a coat that Boone had cut down from one of his own and stitched with the particular care of a man who had no children but understood what children needed. The road to Silver Creek wound through a valley that narrowed to a notch between two ridges, and the town appeared below them like a scattering of wooden blocks left on a floor. One main street, a saloon at the center, freshly painted, the only building that looked like someone spent money on it. A church with a crooked steeple. And on the corner beneath, faded letters that read, "Bridwell General Store." Margaret stood sweeping the porch with the efficiency of a woman who considered idleness a character flaw. Margaret's store smelled of coffee and kerosene and dried apples. She watched Clara enter with eyes that cataloged everything and commented on nothing. She began pulling items from the shelves before Clara even set her list down. Flour, salt, a small cone of sugar wrapped in brown paper. Before Clara could speak, the door opened and cold air brought in a woman who appeared to have been assembled entirely from starch and disapproval. Prudence Whitmore was 50 years old, thin as a fence rail, dressed in a blue wool dress with a cameo at her throat. She carried herself with the absolute certainty of a woman who had decided long ago that her opinion and the Lord's were interchangeable. Two women from the church auxiliary followed her through the door like attendants flanking a queen. Prudence stopped when she saw Clara. Her eyes traveled from Clara's worn boots to her calloused hands to her face sunburned and peeling to the frayed collar of her dress. She smiled the way a cat smiles at a bird it has cornered. "So you are the one, the mail-order bride living with 3 men." She let the word living carry all the weight. No proper husband, no real marriage, and a child being raised in that arrangement. She shook her head with practiced sorrow. Goodness. Wren pressed closer to Clara's leg. She felt his small hand close around her fingers. Clara met Prudence Whitmore's eyes and did not look away. "I am a wife, Mrs. Whitmore, married before God by Reverend Whitley, and Wren has more love in that cabin than most children in this town have in houses twice the size." Prudence's smile tightened. "My cousin is the territorial clerk, dear. Legal is exactly what we are talking about." The two women behind her exchanged glances. The gossip had already started. Clara could see it in their faces. Prudence was the engine. These two were the wheels. Margaret Bridwell stepped between them with the quiet authority of a woman who has broken up conflicts before and has no patience for another one. "Mrs. Whitmore, Your order is ready in the back. Shall I wrap it for you? Prudence held Clara's gaze for one more moment, a moment that said, I know what you are, and I know what happens to women like you in this town. Then she turned and followed Margaret through the back curtain. Clara stood alone in the store. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on the counter until they stopped. Wren still held her other hand. She looked down at him. His face was pale, but his jaw was set, and in his eyes she saw something she recognized. Anger. The particular anger of a child who has watched an adult be cruel and lacks the power to stop it, but not the will. She squeezed his hand. We are all right, she said. We are fine. Margaret returned a few minutes later alone. She leaned across the counter and spoke fast and low. Listen to me. Tobias Hollister has been paying that woman to spread poison. He wants the Calhoun land, has wanted it since before Rose died. Now he has a reason to push. A woman the territory might not recognize as a legal wife. An arrangement the church ladies can call ungodly. You are giving him ammunition, Clara, not because you did anything wrong, because this world punishes women for surviving. She slid the bag of supplies across the counter and tucked something extra inside. Sugar and dried apple slices. For the children, she said. And Clara. She squeezed her hand once hard. You are not alone, even if it feels that way. On the ride home, Clara noticed something that made the hair on her arms rise beneath her sleeves. Fresh hoof prints in the mud around the cabin. The barn door standing open by a hand's width. Silas had left it latched. Inside, nothing had been taken. Nothing broken. But on the table, weighted down by a river stone, was a piece of paper. The handwriting was neat and unhurried. The hand of a man with all the time in the world. We know where she is. To him, Tobias Hollister, marking his territory the way a wolf marks a tree, not to claim it, to let you know he has been there and will come back. Clara folded the note and put it in her pocket. She would need it later. She did not know yet how much. A week passed, the cold deepened. The world contracted to the size of the cabin and the barn and the narrow path between them that Silas shoveled clear each morning before dawn. And then came the morning that changed everything between Clara and the men she had married. Silas and Boone had ridden out before first light to check the herd at the upper pasture. A section of fence had come down in the wind, and a dozen head had scattered into the timber. Clem Hadley was with them. They would be gone all day, maybe into the night. Clara was feeding the stove when she heard it. A sound from the barn, low, guttural. The kind of sound that meant something was either being born or dying. She grabbed the lantern and ran. In the far stall, one of Silas's best heifers lay on her side. Belly distended, legs churning, eyes rolled white. The calf was coming wrong. Clara could see it in the way the heifer strained and thrashed. Breech. The calf was turned sideways, and if it did not come out soon, both the cow and the calf would die. Clara had not done this since she was 14 years old on her father's farm in rural Pennsylvania. The year before, he moved the family to Philadelphia. She remembered the feel of it, the terrible intimacy of reaching inside a laboring animal, the heat and the wet, and the absolute necessity of staying calm when every instinct screamed to panic. She rolled up her sleeves. She talked to the heifer the way her father had taught her, low and steady, a stream of words that meant nothing except I am here, and you are not alone, and we will get through this together. She worked her hand inside and felt for the calf's legs, found one, then the other, twisted. She pulled gently, then firmly, working with the contractions instead of against them. Her shoulders burned, her hands cramped. Sweat ran down her face and mixed with the blood on her forearms. The lantern threw wild shadows against the barn walls, and the heifer groaned, and the straw was dark with fluid, and Clara pulled. Levi appeared in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been watching. Hold the lantern higher, Clara said, and do not look away. He did not look away. He held that lantern like a surgeon's assistant, steady and unwavering, his healer's eyes reading the situation and knowing enough to let Clara lead. And then a shadow moved behind Levi. Wren. The boy stood in the barn entrance wearing nothing but his nightshirt and boots, his breath making clouds in the freezing air. His eyes were enormous, but they did not look away either. The calf came, wet and steaming in the cold. It lay on the straw and blinked and shook its enormous head, and the heifer turned to lick it with a tongue as rough as sandpaper. A sound came from the calf, not quite a cry, more like a question, and the mother answered with her body warm and rough and present. Clara sat back against the stall wall, arms shaking, hands covered in blood and birth and the particular exhaustion that comes from saving something. She let out a breath she felt she had been holding for months. She was still sitting there at dawn when Silas and Boone and Clem rode in. They found her in the barn with the calf nursing the heifer calm the lantern nearly out. Clara's hair had come loose and hung around her face in dark tangles. Her dress was ruined. Her hands were raw. Silas looked at the calf, looked at the heifer, looked at Clara, and in his eyes she saw something new. Not gratitude, not surprise, something deeper. The look of a man watching someone do a thing he thought the world had lost the capacity for. Boone stood behind him, the grinning one, the jokester. He stared at Clara, then at the calf, then back at Clara. His face was serious in a way she had not seen before. "You know how to turn a calf. I grew up on a farm," Clara said. It was the third time she had said it. Each time it carried more weight. Boone nodded slowly, the nod of a man revising a long-held opinion and not enjoying the process but doing it anyway because the evidence left him no choice. Clem Hadley stood behind them, both hat in hand, squinting at the calf, and then at Clara, and then at the calf again. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "That heifer would have died," he said. "Calf, too. You saved $2,000 worth of livestock in the middle of the night in your night clothes." He put his hat back on, pulled it low, walked away. And from that morning forward, Clem Hadley never questioned Clara's presence on the Calhoun ranch again. That evening, after Wren had fallen asleep on Boone's lap by the fire and the cabin had settled into the particular quiet of a household winding down, Silas told Clara the full story of Rose Calhoun. They sat on the porch, stars above, cold pressing in from every side. Silas spoke in the flat, practiced tone of a man who has told this story to himself so many times the words have lost their edges but not their weight. "When we were 28, he said, 6 years ago, our mother was alone in this cabin. She had a cough that would not quit. Getting worse each week. I rode south to sell 4 head of cattle, money for her medicine. Town was 3 days each way." He stopped. His breath made clouds in the cold air. Tobias Hollister had wanted this land for years. Gold in the creek bed, not much but enough to interest a man who already had everything and wanted more. He offered to buy. Ma said no. He offered again. She said no again. He was not a man accustomed to hearing no. Silas looked at his hands, turned them once as if they surprised him. "I was 3 days south when Hollister's men came. Levi was at the trading post in Silver Creek. Boone was checking trap lines on the North Ridge. 3 sons and not one of us was home when she needed us. The wind moved through the porch. Clara waited. Levi found her. He came through the door and the house was quiet. She was on the floor by the stove. She had been beaten. She died sometime in the night, alone in this cabin, on this floor." He swallowed. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The practiced flatness was gone. What remained was raw. "Boone arrived 12 minutes after Levi. He held her for 2 hours. We could not pry him loose. When we finally did, he stood up and walked to the woodpile and chopped wood until his hands bled, and kept chopping until Levi sedated him with a tea he mixed from bark and root. Boone slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, he smiled. He has been smiling ever since. He will not stop, because if he stops, he will have to feel what is underneath." Clara understood then why Boone grinned, why the humor never quite left his face. It was not joy, it was a wall, and she had already seen the cracks. "Could you not prove it was Hollister, Deputy Marshal Crane?" "Hollister's man. Has been for years. Crane made the evidence disappear. No witnesses, no justice. Just a grave behind the cabin and 3 sons who swore they would die on this land before they let the man who killed their mother take it." Clara reached into her coat pocket. She had been carrying this since the first night, the night she found the tin box beneath the bed, and read words that were not meant for her, but that she understood the way only someone who has also lost a parent can understand. "I found this," she said, "in the box under the bed, beneath your mother's photograph. I have been waiting for the right time to give it to you." Silas took the letter. His hands trembled. Not from cold. He read it slowly. Clara did not need to watch. She had memorized every word weeks ago. Silas held the letter for a long time. The paper shook in his grip. He did not cry, but something behind his eyes shifted like a door that had been locked for 6 years being pushed by a wind that would not stop. She knew, Clara said softly. She knew Hollister would come back. And she wrote this so you would not lock yourselves away. Silas folded the letter, pressed it against his chest, held it there the way a man holds a wound to keep the blood inside. Build something worth keeping, he repeated. His voice was barely audible above the wind. We are, Clara said. 2 days later, 2 riders came up the trail. The first was a heavy man on a black horse, well-fed in a land of lean people. He wore a vest buttoned tight over a broad belly, and his face was flushed red from the ride or from whatever he had been drinking at breakfast. His smile was wide and showed too many teeth. His eyes showed nothing at all. Tobias Hollister. Clara had never seen him before, but she knew. The way you know a rattlesnake by the sound it makes before it strikes. The second rider wore a deputy's star pinned to a coat that had seen better days. His hand rested on the butt of his holstered pistol. Not gripping, just resting. A reminder. Deputy Marshal Crane. Silas stepped out of the barn. Levi came from the woodpile. Boone appeared from behind the cabin with an axe in his hand and Wren behind his legs. 4 adults and a child arranged in a loose half-circle facing the riders. Hollister reined in and looked at Clara the way a man looks at a horse he is thinking about buying. Eyes moving from her face to her hands to the cabin behind her. Taking inventory, Calhoun Hollister said. His voice was pleasant, conversational. The voice of a man who has practiced being reasonable while meaning nothing of the kind. I hear you have got company. A woman from back east with no legal standing on this land. His smile widened, but his eyes did not change. I am a reasonable man. The woman leaves and we forget about this arrangement. You keep the land. Nobody gets hurt. Silas did not raise his voice. She stays. Hollister's smile flickered. Then it returned broader, more teeth. A mail-order bride, living with 3 men and a stray boy. The territorial court will not look kindly on that. He paused and let the pause do its work, especially when Judge Ashford's petition arrives. The name hit Clara like a fist to the chest. Ashford. Not Hollister acting alone. Ashford. The judge from Philadelphia, Vincent's father. They had found her, and they had found each other. Hollister watched her reaction with the satisfaction of a man playing a hand he knows cannot lose. The judge and I have been corresponding, he said. Seems you took something that belongs to his family. And it seems the territory of Montana has a very dim view of women who steal from judges and run off to live in sin with 3 mountain men. Silas took 1 step forward. His voice was low and even and carried the weight of granite. You are on my land. You have 30 seconds to get off it. Hollister gathered his reins, but he was not finished. He turned in the saddle and looked at Clara one final time. His voice carried clear in the cold morning air. Ask them about Rose. Ask how their mother really died when 3 strong sons were nowhere to be found. Maybe they did not tell you that part. Then he was gone, dust and snow settling behind him, the sound of hooves fading down the trail, and a silence so thick it pressed against Clara's ears like water. She looked at Silas. His face had gone white, not with anger, with something older, something that lived in the place behind his ribs, where he kept the things he could not say. I already know, Clara said. He told me to ask, but I already know, and I know the truth. You went because of her. You rode 3 days for medicine for your mother. That is not leaving. That is love. Silas looked at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then something in his face released, not all of it, but enough. A knot loosening, a breath let go. The morning was still clear, the sky still blue, but everything had changed. 4 days later, a stranger arrived in Silver Creek. He wore a suit that cost more than most Montana ranchers earned in a year. He asked questions at the post office, the saloon, the general store. He asked about a young blonde woman from Philadelphia. He asked with a courtesy that made people want to answer. His name was Edwin Gale. He was a Pinkerton detective, and Judge Harmon Ashford had sent him west to find Clara and retrieve the journal she had stolen. Margaret brought the warning first. Rode out to the canyon on her mule, wrapped in so many layers, she looked twice her size, her face red with cold and tight with urgency. There is a man in town, Pinkerton, asking about you by name. He has your description. He knows you are here. Clara stood on the porch and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had known this would come. She had known from the moment she took the journal that the Ashfords would not simply let her disappear. But knowing a thing and facing it are different animals, and the one that stood before her now was larger and hungrier than she had prepared for. Silas reached for his rifle. Boone's grin vanished. Levi moved to stand in front of Wren, who had appeared in the doorway, his carved horse clutched in both hands. "He will come here," Silas said, "and when he does, he will not leave with her." But Edwin Gale did not come to take Clara. He came to warn her. He arrived the next morning on a rented horse riding up the trail with both hands visible, a gesture of peace that suggested he understood exactly what kind of men lived at the end of this road and what they would do to someone who arrived with hostile intentions. Silas met him at the fence line with a rifle across his chest. Levi stood behind him with an axe. Boone leaned against the barn door, still grinning, but the grin had turned to something cold and sharp. Gale dismounted slowly. He was 45, lean, with the weathered face of a man who had spent 2 decades chasing people across a continent and had grown tired of the running, but not of the truth. "I am not here to take anyone," he said. "I am here because I have spent 3 weeks investigating Judge Harmon Ashford, and what I have found would turn your stomach." They brought him inside. He sat at the table and drank the coffee Clara poured and spoke in the measured tones of a man presenting evidence to a jury. "Ashford did not just cover up his son's murders," Gale said. "He profited from them. The first wife had property in her name. It reverted to Vincent upon her death. The second wife had a small inheritance. Same pattern." He paused. "And your father's estate, Miss Whitfield, the debts that the judge so generously cleared, those debts were manufactured. Your father owed nothing. Ashford created the paper trail to force your mother into marriage and you into Vincent's hands." Clara sat very still. The words entered her one at a time, each one landing like a stone dropped into still water. Her father had owed nothing. The debts were false. Her mother's marriage, her own engagement, the entire architecture of control that had brought her to the edge of a grave beneath roses, all of it built on forgery. She thought of her father, Arthur Whitfield, the school teacher who loved books, the man who died believing he had failed his family. He had not failed. He had been murdered by paperwork. "There is more," Gale said. His voice dropped. "Ashford has been writing to Tobias Hollister. They are combining forces. Ashford wants the journal destroyed. Hollister wants the land. Together they intend to burn this canyon to the ground if necessary." He looked at Silas. 50 men, Mr. Calhoun. Hollister has been hiring riders for the past 2 weeks. Armed. I have seen the camp at his ranch. 50 men. The number hung in the air like smoke. 3 brothers and a woman and a child against 50 armed men. "What will you do?" Silas asked. Gale stood, buttoned his coat. His face showed the particular exhaustion of a man who has served the wrong master and discovered it too late. "I will go back to Philadelphia," he said. "I will tell Ashford I lost the trail. That buys you weeks, not months." He looked at Clara. "And I will see to it that the documents I have found regarding your father's estate reach the right hands. The debts were forged. The property was stolen. That is a federal matter, not a territorial one. It will take time. But the truth has a way of outlasting the men who try to bury it." He walked to the door, stopped, turned back. "One more thing. Vincent Ashford left Philadelphia 4 days ago. He is on his way to Montana. He is not a patient man, and he is not coming to negotiate." Then Gale was gone, the sound of his horse fading down the trail, and 5 people stood in a cabin that suddenly felt much smaller than it had that morning. That night, Clara sat at the table and took out the journal. She placed it flat on the wood surface and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Silas. "I should leave," she said. "If I go, Ashford follows me. Hollister only has the land claim. Without me, the journal does not matter to him. You can fight one enemy. You cannot fight 2. Silas was standing by the window. He turned slowly. His face was open in a way she had not seen before. The careful reserve he wore like armor had been set aside, and what remained was something unguarded and raw, and more frightening than any threat from outside. "You are not leaving," he said. "I am not asking permission. I am telling you what makes sense. Sense." He repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Sense would have been not answering your letter. Sense would have been riding right past another person who needed help. I stopped making sense the day I decided to let someone in. Clara stood, crossed the space between them, stood in front of him with her arms at her sides, looking up at this man who was built like a mountain and carried himself like a question he could not answer. "We face this together," she said, not as a request, as a declaration. He looked at her. The amber of his eyes caught the firelight and held it. "Together," he said. The days that followed moved with the particular urgency of people preparing for a storm they cannot outrun. Silas rode to the county recorder's office and filed a formal homestead petition for the cabin in 160 acres. He came back with a document stamped and dated and signed by the clerk. Not full ownership that would take years, but it was legal. It was on record. It gave Clara and Wren an address, a home recognized by the territory of Montana. "You did this for the hearing," Clara said when she saw the document. "I did this because it should have been done a long time ago," Silas said. "A man ought to put his name on the place he means to stay." Clara sat at the kitchen table each night after Wren fell asleep and organized her evidence. The journal, the threatening note from Hollister, the advertisement in Silas's reply letter, Rose's letter as proof of Hollister's pattern of terrorizing the Calhoun family. She numbered the pages, built her case the way her father had taught her to build an argument, one fact at a time, each one supporting the next, each one a stone in a wall meant to stand. Boone taught Clara to shoot. She learned quickly. Her hands were steady and her eye was true. When she put 3 rounds through a tin can at 30 paces, Boone whistled through his teeth. "Farm girl aim," he said, half surprised, half proud. Levi prepared medical supplies, bandages, poultices from herbs he had gathered all autumn, needles and thread for stitching wounds. He worked with the quiet efficiency of a man who hoped for the best and planned for the worst and knew the difference between the two. Clara packed the original journal with Margaret's next supply run. Margaret would mail it to the U.S. Marshal in Helena. If the evidence survived, the truth would outlast whatever Hollister and Ashford could throw at them. Clara kept her handwritten copies, backup, insurance, and Boone sat with Wren. Every evening while the adults prepared for war, Boone sat with the boy and whittled. He was carving something new. Larger than the animals on the shelf, more detailed. Clara watched his hands move over the wood, peeling away curls of pine, revealing what was underneath. A horse, small enough to fit in a child's fist, perfect in its proportions. On the night before the last night, Boone gave it to Wren. "Hold on to this," he said. "I will come find you when it is over." Wren looked at the horse, looked at Boone. His lower lip trembled, but his eyes did not waver. Promise Boone's grin was still there, the wall still standing. But his eyes, for the first time since Clara had known him, were not smiling at all. Promise. Margaret arrived the next morning. She had ridden through the night. Her mule was lathered. Her face was white. "Clara, Hollister has 50 armed men at his ranch, and there is more. Vincent Ashford arrived in Silver Creek yesterday, on the afternoon stage. He is at the saloon right now drinking with Hollister." She paused to breathe. Her hands shook on the reins. "They are not filing a court case. They are past that. Hollister wants the land. Vincent wants you in that journal. They are coming, Clara. 3 days, maybe less, more." Reverend Whitley had been threatened, pressured to revoke the marriage certificate. Crane was patrolling the road into the canyon, counting guns, mapping positions. Clara looked at the men who had given her a home. Silas standing straight and still by the barn door. Levi already reaching for his medical kit. Boone sitting on the porch step with Wren in his lap, the boy's face pressed against his chest, the wooden horse clutched in both small hands. "How many bullets do we have?" Clara asked. The question was not asked with fear. It was asked with the voice of a woman who has walked 2,000 miles and pulled a calf from a dying cow and fixed a fence in a blizzard and dug up the bones of murdered women with her bare hands. A woman who had carried too much for too long and was done being carried. It was the voice of Clara Calhoun, and everyone who heard it understood that whatever was coming up that canyon would have to come through her first. That night was the last quiet night. Wren fell asleep on Boone's lap. Levi carried the boy to his cot and tucked the blanket around his shoulders and placed the wooden horse within reach of his fingers. Boone watched from across the room with the expression of a man memorizing something he is afraid he will forget. Clara and Silas sat on the porch. The stars were hard and bright. The air was so cold it turned breath to crystal. Below them, the canyon stretched dark and silent, and somewhere at the far end beyond the narrow entrance, 50 men were sharpening their weapons and waiting for morning. "Are you ready?" Clara asked. "No," Silas said, "but I am going anyway. That is the only kind of ready that matters." Silence settled between them, but it was not the empty silence of strangers or the heavy silence of grief. It was the full silence of two people who have said everything that needs to be said and are now simply being together in the time they have left. Clara leaned into him. His arm came around her shoulders. She felt the weight of it, the warmth, the steadiness. Then Silas turned his head. Clara lifted her face, and in the space between the stars and the snow and the darkness, pressing in from every side, they kissed for the first time. It was not the kiss of young lovers or the desperate kiss of people who have run out of options. It was soft and sure and unhurried, the kiss of two people who had lost everything and found each other and understood that what they were building was not a fire but a hearth, the kind of warmth that does not blaze and fade but holds steady through the long nights and the hard years and the ordinary days that make up a life. When they pulled apart, Clara pressed her forehead to his. She could feel his heartbeat through the layers between them. "I have one more thing to say," she whispered. "Say it. If something happens tomorrow, if the worst happens, I want you to know, I chose this. I chose you. Not because I was desperate, because I wanted to." Silas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "I chose you too, the day I read your letter, before I knew your face. I chose the woman who wrote, 'I have nowhere else to go,' like it was a battle cry instead of a surrender." The door behind them was closed. The night was cold, and the stars were bright, and somewhere in the canyon, an owl called once and received no answer. Clara held Silas, and Silas held Clara, and neither of them spoke about what morning would bring. When dawn came, it came hard and bright, the kind of morning that does not care what you have planned. Clara dressed in the dark. She checked the rifle Boone had taught her to load. She checked the evidence packet she had prepared for the U.S. Marshal. She checked on Wren, sleeping with his hand curled around the wooden horse, his face peaceful in a way that made her chest ache. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the trail that led down to the canyon entrance. Nothing yet, just snow and silence and the first light turning the mountaintops to gold. But they were coming. She could feel it this way you feel a storm before the sky changes, a pressure in the air, a humming in the ground, the weight of 50 horses moving toward her across the frozen earth. Clara picked up the rifle, checked the chamber, set it by the door. She was not going to run, not from this place, not from these people, not from the life she had fought across 2,000 miles to build. Let them come. They came at dawn. Clara heard them before she saw them. Not hooves at first, just a hum, the kind that climbs from the frozen ground when weight begins to draw near. She was standing at the window with the rifle Boone had given her, her breath making fog on the glass, her eyes fixed on the narrow trail that led down from the canyon mouth. Then the shapes appeared. Riders, a line of them stretching back through the trees like a dark thread being pulled through white cloth. 10, 20, more behind those. Horses breathing steam, metal catching the first light. Men sitting heavy in their saddles with the particular stillness of people who have been paid to do violence and are waiting for the signal to begin. At the head of the column rode Tobias Hollister. He sat his black horse the way he sat everything, with the bloated confidence of a man who has never been told no by anyone strong enough to make it stick. His vest buttons caught the sun. His face was flushed. His smile showed every tooth. And beside him, mounted on a rented sorrel that he handled with the stiffness of a man who had not ridden in years, was Vincent Ashford. Clara had not seen him in 2 months. He looked the same. Tall, thin, dark suit that did not belong in this landscape. Clean-shaved jaw, eyes that calculated the value of everything and found nothing worth more than himself. He sat in the saddle the way he had sat across from her at dinner tables in Philadelphia, with a patience that was not patience at all, but the particular stillness of a predator who knows his prey has nowhere left to run. Clara felt her fingers tighten on the rifle stock, not with fear, with the cold, precise anger of a woman who has seen what this man does To the women who marry him and who has decided that the chain of bones ends here. Silas was already at the front door, rifle loaded, face carved from stone. Levi positioned himself at the side window, his medical bag behind him on the floor ready. Boone stood at the rear door with a shotgun and the kind of grin that had nothing to do with amusement and everything to do with a man who has spent 6 years waiting for a fight and is about to get one. Ren. Clara turned and knelt in front of the boy. He stood in the center of the cabin in his nightshirt, the wooden horse clutched against his chest, his eyes enormous and dark. "Listen to me," Clara said. Her voice was steady. She placed both hands on his thin shoulders. "You are going to go to the root cellar, the one Boone showed you beneath the kitchen floor. You are going to take your horse and your blanket, and you are going to stay there until one of us comes to get you. Do you understand?" Ren looked at her. He looked at Boone. He looked at the rifle in Clara's hand. Then the boy, who barely spoke, said the longest sentence Clara had ever heard from him. "I do not want to hide while you fight." Clara's heart cracked open right down the center. She pulled him against her and held him tight enough to feel his small heart hammering against her own. "I know," she whispered, "but the bravest thing you can do right now is survive. Can you do that for me?" Ren pulled back. His jaw was set in a way that made him look 40 instead of 7. He nodded once. Then he climbed down through the trap door into the root cellar, and Clara closed it over him and pushed a rug across the boards and prayed to whatever listened that the floor would hold. Hollister's voice carried across the snow like a stone skipping over ice. "Calhoun, we know you have got the girl. Send her out. Hand over the journal. Keep the land. Nobody dies." Silas answered from the window. His voice carried no heat, only the flat weight of absolute certainty. "She is not yours. She never was." Vincent Ashford dismounted. He walked forward 3 steps out of the line of riders standing alone in the snow, with his dark suit and his dark eyes and his voice that was so polite it could cut glass. "Mrs. Ashford," he called, "or whatever you are calling yourself now, you have something that belongs to my family. Return the journal and come home quietly. No one needs to get hurt." Clara moved to the other window. She showed herself. Let him see her face. Let him see the rifle. Let him see that the woman he had planned to bury beneath roses was standing upright with a weapon in her hands and no intention of lying down. "My name is Clara Calhoun," she said, "and I am already home." Vincent's composure flickered. For 1 second, the mask slipped and she saw what lived underneath. Not anger, something colder. The flat reptilian patience of a man who has killed before and considers it an inconvenience rather than a sin. "You dug in my garden, Clara. You found things you were not supposed to find. That was a mistake. The only mistake was yours, Vincent. Writing down what you did to those women. I have the journal, and the U.S. Marshal in Helena will have it by week's end." The change in Vincent's face was instant. The politeness fell away like a curtain pulled from a window, and what stood in the snow was not a man from Philadelphia in a fine suit, but something emptier and more dangerous. He turned to Hollister. His voice was thin and sharp. "Burn the cabin." Hollister raised his arm, dropped it. The first volley came like thunder breaking across a clear sky. 50 rifles firing at once. The sound hit the cabin walls, and the walls held the logs, absorbing the rounds with dull thuds that shook dust from the rafters. Glass shattered. Cold air screamed through the broken windows. A lamp toppled and oil spread across the floor, and Levi stamped it out before it could catch. Clara fired. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. A man who had been running toward the cabin with a torch fell forward into the snow. The torch guttered and went out. Clara racked another round and fired again. Farm girl aim. The second shot splintered the fence post beside a rider's head and sent his horse rearing. Silas fired methodically from the front window. Each shot placed, each pause measured. He did not waste ammunition because he could not afford to, and he did not rush because rushing was how men died. Boone held the rear. His shotgun roared twice, and the riders attempting to circle behind the barns scattered. The noise was enormous, continuous. A wall of sound that pressed against Clara's skull and made thought impossible. She fired and did not think about the men she was shooting at, because if she thought about them, she would stop, and if she stopped, Ren would die in the cellar beneath her feet. An hour passed, maybe 2. Time lost its shape inside the noise. Levi took a bullet. It caught his left shoulder and spun him away from the window. He hit the floor, and blood spread dark and fast across his shirt. Clara was beside him in seconds, pressing cloth against the wound, using the techniques he had taught her during the quiet weeks when they had prepared for this and prayed it would not come. "Keep pressure on it," Levi said through gritted teeth. "Do not let me bleed. I can still shoot with my right hand." She bound his shoulder with strips torn from a tablecloth. The blood soaked through immediately. She bound it again. Tighter. Levi hissed but did not cry out. He took the rifle in his right hand and returned to the window and kept firing. Outside, Hollister's men were regrouping. They had expected the cabin to fall quickly. 4 people against 50 should not have lasted an hour. But the canyon was a natural fortress. One narrow entrance, cliff walls on both sides, and the Calhouns had been preparing for this fight for 6 years. But preparation has limits, and ammunition has limits, and the living have limits that the well-supplied and the numerous do not. Silas counted the remaining rounds. His face told Clara everything before he spoke. "We are running low. They are going to breach the walls within the hour." Clara looked at the cabin, at the bullet holes in the logs, at Levi bleeding against the wall, at Boone crouched by the rear door, his grin gone, his face the face of a man doing arithmetic with lives and not liking the sum. And she looked at this floor, at the rug that covered the trapdoor, at the book hiding beneath it with a wooden horse and a promise. Boone spoke. His voice was quiet, calm, clear. "I'm going to trigger the avalanche trap." The words fell into the room like stones into a well. Silas turned. "No, the detonator is on the far ridge." Boone pointed through the broken window, a quarter-mile across open ground, uphill, through the line of fire. The charges are buried in the snow shelf above the canyon mouth. If that shelf comes down, it buries the entrance, buries everything in this valley, including you," Silas said. Boone looked at his brother. The grin came back. But it was different now. It was not a wall. It was a window. And behind it, for the first time, Clara could see everything that Boone Calhoun had been carrying since the day he held his dead mother for 2 hours, and then stood up and smiled and never stopped. "I have been the fastest of us 3 since we were boys," Boone said. "You know that." Silas's jaw worked. His hands trembled on the rifle stock. Levi had gone still by the wall, his face white, his eyes bright with pain, and something worse. Clara stepped forward. "You cannot. There has to be another way." Boone looked at her. He held her gaze with an expression that was not sad, and not brave, and not resigned, but somehow all 3 at once, the face of a man who has made a decision and found peace with it in the same breath. "Clara, you came here running from a man who buries women in gardens. You walked 2,000 miles. You fixed my brother's fence in a blizzard. You pulled a calf out of a dying cow at 3 in the morning. You taught a boy who could not speak to say the word stay." He paused. "You built something worth keeping. Let me make sure it stays standing." He knelt beside the trap door, pulled back the rug, opened it. Wren's face looked up from the dark. The wooden horse was still in his hands. His cheeks were streaked with tears. He had been crying silently the way children cry when they have learned that no one is coming and the only person left to be brave for is themselves. Boone reached down and placed his hand on the boy's head. His fingers were large and rough and infinitely gentle. "Hey, partner, I have to go do something important, but I need you to hold on to this for me, all right?" He took the wooden horse from Wren's hands and turned it over. On the bottom, carved in small letters that Clara had never noticed before, were 2 words, "Keep going." Boone placed the horse back in Wren's hands. He closed the boy's fingers around it. "Promise me," Boone said. "You hold on to that. You keep going, no matter what." "Promise," Wren whispered. "Good man." Boone smiled, not the wall smile, not the armor smile, the real one. The one that had been underneath all along, waiting for the right moment to come out. He stood, looked at Levi. "Brother?" Levi could not speak. He pressed his good hand against the wound in his shoulder, and tears ran down his face, and he shook his head once, twice, as if by shaking hard enough, he could change the equation that everyone in the room had already solved. Boone looked at Silas. His eyes were clear, absolutely clear. The eyes of a man who has seen the bottom of his own darkness and found there in the deepest part something worth climbing toward. "Take care of them, Silas." He paused. "Build something worth keeping." Rose Calhoun's words, written in a letter before she died. spoken now by her son before he followed her. Then Boone was at the door. He did not hesitate. He did not look back. The door opened and the cold and the noise poured in, and he was running. Clara watched through the window. She could not look away, and she could not close her eyes, and she could not stop the scream that built in her chest and pressed against her ribs like something alive. Boone ran across open ground. Bullets kicked up snow around his boots. He ran low and fast with the particular speed of a man who has nothing left to lose and everything left to save. A round caught his coat. Another grazed his forearm. He kept running. The ridge, the detonator, a wooden box half buried in snow wires trailing to the charges planted in the shelf above the canyon mouth. Boone reached it, threw open the lid. The fuse wire was cut. A stray bullet had severed it somewhere along the line. The detonator was useless. Clara saw him stop, saw him look at the broken wire, saw him look back at the cabin. The distance between them was a quarter-mile and a lifetime, and a promise that he had already decided to keep. Boone pulled a match from his coat. He looked at the charges buried in the snow 6 feet from where he knelt. He looked at the match. He understood the mathematics. Light the charges by hand. The blast would take the shelf. The shelf would take the canyon. The canyon would take everything, including him. He struck the match. The flame caught and bent in the wind. He cupped his hands around it, protecting the small fire with fingers that had carved wooden horses, and wiped a child's tears and held his mother's body for 2 hours on a cabin floor. He looked at the cabin one last time. His mouth moved. Clara could not hear the words across the distance and the gunfire, but she read his lips. Keep going. He touched the match to the fuse. The explosion was a sound that Clara would hear for the rest of her life. Not a bang, a roar. The voice of the mountain itself waking up and speaking and saying enough in a language older than English and louder than war. The snow shelf cracked, split, and then it moved. 10,000 tons of snow and rock and ice cascaded down the ridge face in a wall of white that swallowed everything in its path. It poured into the canyon mouth like water through a broken dam. Riders and horse and guns and Tobias Hollister on his black horse, all of them swept under the white wave like insects beneath a boot. The shock wave hit the cabin. The remaining windows blew inward. Part of the roof collapsed. Clara was thrown to the floor and covered her head as beams and shingles rained down. The stove tipped. Smoke filled the room. Then silence. A silence so total and so complete that it seemed to have weight, as if the mountain had spoken its one word and now had nothing left to say. Clara raised her head. Dust and snow hung in the air. Silas was on the floor beside her, blood on his forehead from a falling beam. Levi was curled against the wall, arms over his head, his wounded shoulder pressed to the logs. Clara crawled to the window, looked out. The canyon was gone. Where there had been a narrow valley with a trail and a creek and 50 armed men, there was now a flat white field stretching from wall to wall, smooth, silent, untouched, as if nothing had ever existed there at all. Boone! Clara screamed his name. She screamed it until her throat tore and her voice went to rust, and still she screamed because the alternative to screaming was understanding, and she was not ready to understand. Silas caught her, held her. His arms were around her, and his face was in her hair, and his body was shaking. She did not know if it was grief or cold or the exhaustion of a man who has just lost his brother and saved his family and cannot yet tell the difference between the two. Below the floor, the trapdoor opened. Wren climbed out. He stood in the ruined cabin with plaster dust in his hair and the wooden horse in his hands and looked around at the broken windows and the collapsed roof and the 3 adults who were crying. He walked to Clara, took her hand, looked up at her with those eyes that were decades too old. He promised, Wren said. His voice trembled. He said he would come find me. Clara knelt and pulled the boy against her chest and held him the way Boone had held Rose Calhoun on the cabin floor 6 years ago, the way the living hold the memory of the dead when there is nothing left to hold but love. The days that followed were the hardest of Clara's life, and Clara had lived a life that did not deal in easy. The cabin was half buried. The roof had partially collapsed. The stove was toppled and the chimney cracked. They could not stay. And the only way out was up over the debris field that had once been Dead Man's Canyon and then 85 miles to Silver Creek on foot through snow that reached Clara's thighs. No horses, no snowshoes, no winter gear beyond what they were wearing. The temperature was 15 below zero and falling. Silas dug them out through the chimney pipe. He worked for 6 hours, his hands raw, his breath freezing on his beard, creating an air shaft and then a passage wide enough for a body. He emerged onto the snowfield first, then reached back for the others. Clara handed Ren up, then Levi, his shoulder wound, weeping through the bandages, his face the color of old candle wax. Then Clara climbed out herself. They stood on the snow in the pale morning light and looked at the world that Boone's sacrifice had made. White, flat, silent. The canyon walls still stood on either side, scarred and broken, where the avalanche had torn away trees and rock. But the floor between them was smooth, a burial ground a quarter-mile long and 20 feet deep. Somewhere beneath it, Tobias Hollister and his 50 men. Somewhere beneath it, Boone Calhoun, who had lit a match and spoken 2 words and traded his life for theirs. Clara looked at Silas, at Levi, at Ren. She looked at the 85 miles between them and Silver Creek. "We walk," she said. They walked. The first day nearly killed them. The snow was deep, and the cold was a living thing that found every gap in their clothing and every crack in their resolve. Ren rode on Silas's back for the first 4 hours, then on Clara's when Silas needed both arms free to break trail. Levi walked under his own power, his right hand gripping his left arm to keep the wounded shoulder still. He did not complain. He put one foot in front of the other and breathed through his teeth and did not stop. They ate nothing the first day, drank melted snow from their hands, slept that night in a hollow beneath a fallen pine, the 4 of them pressed together, sharing body heat. Clara held Ren against her chest and felt the boy shivering and sang to him songs she did not know. She remembered songs her father had sung in their small Philadelphia house a lifetime ago. The second day, Silas snared a rabbit. They ate it half raw, crouching over a small fire that took an hour to start with frozen fingers and damp wood. The meat was tough and bland, and it was the best thing Clara had ever tasted because it meant they were alive. And alive meant meant there was still a chance. Levi's shoulder worsened. The wound had gone hot red swollen. Infection. Clara used the herbs from his medical bag, the ones he had taught her to recognize during the quiet weeks before the siege. Yarrow for the fever, pine needle tea for the inflammation. She packed the wound with a poultice of bark and snow and prayed it would hold. On the 3rd night, the wolves came. Clara heard them first, a howl that started low and climbed and split into harmonics that made the darkness seem to lean closer. Then another howl, closer, then the sound of paws on crusted snow, a light sound patient, the sound of animals who know that time is on their side. Silas stood. He had a knife, one knife. It had belonged to his mother, and it had a blade 7 inches long and an edge that he had sharpened every night of the journey. "Stay behind me," he said. The first wolf came from the left, gray, thin, eyes that caught the firelight and held it like 2 small lamps. Silas did not wait for it to lunge. He stepped forward and met it in the space between the fire and the darkness. The wolf leaped. Silas caught it by the throat and drove the knife into its ribs, and the animal screamed a sound that was not human and not entirely animal, but something in between, something old and wild and final. A second wolf came from the right. Silas turned too slowly. The animal's jaws closed on his forearm. Clara heard the sound of teeth on leather and flesh, and she grabbed a burning branch from the fire and drove it into the wolf's face. The animal released Silas and scrambled backwards, snarling, the hair on its muzzle singed. Silas killed it with the knife. Quick. Clean. The pack retreated into the darkness and did not return. Clara bound Silas's arm with strips from her own coat. The wound was deep. The blood was bright. But the arm still worked, and the hand still gripped, and the man still stood. Ren had not moved during the attack. He sat by the fire with the wooden horse in his lap, and his eyes open and his body absolutely still. Not frozen with fear, still with something else. The stillness of a child who has decided that he will not run, that he will sit where he was told to sit and wait for the people who promise to come back for him and trust that they will. The horse said, "Keep going," on its belly. Ren had been reading it every night by firelight, tracing the letters with his finger. Keep going, keep going, keep going. On the 7th day, they saw Silver Creek. It appeared below them in the valley like something remembered from a dream. Wooden buildings, chimney smoke. the suggestion of warmth and food and walls that did not have bullet holes in them. They stumbled down the last ridge and through the snow, drifted Main Street. They looked like ghosts. Clara's face was cracked and bleeding from the cold. Silas's arm was bound in bloody rags. Levi was barely conscious, supported between Clara and Silas, his feet dragging. Ren walked under his own power, the wooden horse in his hand, his small boots leaving prints in the snow that were shockingly regular, shockingly steady. The footprints of a child who had decided that he would walk until he could not walk, and then he would crawl. Margaret Bridwell saw them from the porch of her boarding house. She dropped the broom she was holding. It clattered on the boards and she did not pick it up. She came down the steps and into the street with her hands pressed against her mouth and tears already running. Her eyes moved from face to face, counting. "Where is the third?" she asked. "Gone," Silas said. His voice was a ruin. "He saved us." Margaret did not ask how. She did not ask for details. She simply opened her door in her arms and her home and pulled them inside, and for the first time in 7 days, Clara sat down in a warm room and stopped moving. The doctor saved Levi's arm. The infection had spread but had not yet reached the bone. 2 weeks of treatment, poultices, rest, and the particular stubbornness of a man whose body refused to quit even when his mind had given up. Clara lost 2 toes to frostbite. The doctor took them with a song and an apology, and Clara gripped the chair arms and did not scream because Ren was in the next room, and she would not let that sound be part of what he carried. Silas's arm healed with scars that joined the others. His collection, Boone would have called it. The thought came to Clara unbidden, and she pressed her hand against her mouth and breathed until the grief subsided to a level she could carry. The news came in pieces over the following weeks. The U.S. Marshal in Helena received the journal. An investigation was opened. Riders were sent to the Ashford property in Philadelphia. They dug in the garden. They found bones exactly where Clara said they would be. Vincent Ashford was found alive. He had retreated to the rear of Hollister's column the moment the first shots were fired, letting hired men do the dying he had ordered. When the snow came down, cowardice saved him where courage would not have. He was found 3 days later by a search party half frozen in a gully, a mile south of the canyon mouth, crawling toward the road with a broken leg and the particular desperation of a man who has always let others pay his debts. He was arrested in a hospital bed in Billings. Judge Harmon Ashford was stripped of his position. Federal investigators found the forged documents, the manufactured debts, the stolen property, the pattern of corruption that stretched back a decade. He was arrested in his own courthouse, let out in irons past the portrait of himself that hung above the bench. Deputy Marshal Crane was suspended and then dismissed and then arrested for obstruction and conspiracy. Tobias Hollister was never found. He lay somewhere beneath the snow in Dead Man's Canyon, buried with his ambition and his black horse and the gold he had killed for and never touched. The trial was held in Helena. A federal judge presided. Clara rode the stage for 2 days to be there. She brought Ren. She brought her stack of papers tied with kitchen string. She brought the stub of a pencil in her pocket. She did not bring a lawyer because she could not afford one, and because she had learned that the truth spoken plainly was its own best counsel. The courtroom was large and cold and filled with people who had read about the case in the territorial newspapers. Clara walked to the witness stand and placed her papers on the rail before her and looked at the judge and did not look away. Vincent Ashford sat at the defendant's table in chains. His dark suit was wrinkled. His face had lost its careful composure. What remained was something small and sharp and empty, the face of a man who has run out of masks. Judge Ashford was not present. He was in a federal holding cell in Philadelphia, awaiting his own trial. Clara stood when invited to speak. Her hands trembled. She pressed them flat against the rail. Then she picked up her papers and stepped forward. "Your Honor, my name is Clara May Calhoun. My maiden name was Whitfield. My father was a school teacher named Arthur Whitfield, who died of consumption in the spring of 1887. He left behind no debts. The debts attributed to his estate were forged by Judge Harmon Ashford to create a dependency that would deliver my mother into his household and me into his son's hands." She paused. "Let the courtroom hear. I discovered 2 sets of human remains buried in the garden of the Ashford estate in Philadelphia. I found a journal written by Vincent Ashford in which he described the murders of his first and second wives. I was intended to be the third. I fled. I married. I built a life. And the men I fled from followed me across a continent and brought 50 armed riders to burn my home and kill my family. She placed the evidence on the judge's bench. The handwritten copies of Vincent's journal entries, the threatening note from Hollister, the homestead claim, Rose Calhoun's letter. 3 brothers took me in when I had nowhere to go. They gave me a home and a family and a reason to believe that honest people still exist. One of those brothers gave his life to save us. His name was Boone Calhoun, and he died on a mountainside in Montana Territory lighting a match so that a 7-year-old boy and a woman from Philadelphia and his 2 brothers could live. She looked at Vincent. He did not meet her eyes. I do not have a lawyer, she said. I do not have money or connections. But I have the truth, and I have myself, and I am asking this court to see what I see. That the man sitting in that chair is not a victim of theft or abandonment. He is a murderer, and the judge who sent him to Montana is his accomplice. She sat down. The courtroom was quiet. Then Clem Hadley stood up. He was sitting in the back row. He wore a coat that had been brushed for what appeared to be the first time in its existence. His hat was new. His face was freshly shaved and pink from the razor. He looked as uncomfortable as a man can look, while also looking deeply, unmistakably moved. Your Honor, I work for the Calhoun Ranch. Have for 5 years seasonal. When Silas first brought this woman to the cabin, I thought he was out of his mind. More mouths in winter. I said as much to his face. He paused, looked at Clara. His squint was gone. What replaced it was something raw and honest and hard-won. I was wrong. I have watched that woman fix fence in a blizzard with her bare hands bleeding. I have seen her pull a breech calf in the middle of the night by lantern light when neither me nor the brothers were there to help. I have eaten her cooking when she had so little that I know she went without so the rest of us could eat. He swallowed hard. There is a boy named Wren who did not speak for 2 years before she came. Now he talks. He calls her Ma. Those people in that cabin are a family, the best I have ever seen. And if this court needs someone to say that Clara Calhoun is a good woman and a fit mother and the bravest person I have ever met, I am saying it. And I will swear to it on anything you put in front of me. He sat down. His face was red. He put his hat on and stared straight ahead. The judge rendered his verdict the same afternoon. Vincent Ashford was found guilty of murder in the first degree. 2 counts. The evidence from the journal corroborated by the physical remains found in the garden was conclusive. He was sentenced to hang. Judge Harmon Ashford was found guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. The forged debts, the stolen estate, the complicity in covering up his son's crimes. He would spend the remainder of his life in prison. And the estate of Arthur Whitfield, seized through manufactured debts, was ordered returned to its rightful heir, $50,000. Clara sat in the courtroom and heard the number and felt nothing. Not joy, not relief. She felt the weight of what that money had cost. A father who died believing he had failed. A mother who married a monster out of despair. 2 women buried in a garden. A man named Boone who lit a match on a mountainside. $50,000. It could rebuild the ranch, expand the herd, send Wren to school, give them all the life that Rose Calhoun had dreamed of when she wrote Build Something Worth Keeping. But it could not bring back the dead. No amount ever could. Outside the courthouse, Silas waited on the steps. He did not ask how it went. He read the answer in Clara's face. She walked down the steps and into his arms and pressed her face against his chest, and he held her the way mountains hold snow, quietly and completely, and with the understanding that some things are heavy enough to need the whole of you. Wren ran from where Margaret had been holding him and hit Clara's legs at full speed. She caught him and lifted him, and the 3 of them stood on the courthouse steps in the winter sun and held on. Levi stood behind them, his arm in a sling, his face pale, his eyes bright. He placed his good hand on Silas's shoulder and left it there, and the 4 of them formed a shape that was not a circle because a circle has no gaps, and this shape had a gap. Boone's gap. It would always be there, but the shape still held. It held because the people who made it had decided that holding was what they would do even when part of them was missing. They held the wedding under the cottonwood tree behind where the cabin had stood. It was late March of 1888. The first buds were breaking on the branches. The air smelled of wet earth and pine and the distant possibility of summer. No preacher. Reverend Whitley had passed in February quietly in his sleep, an old man who had lived long enough to marry a desperate woman to 3 mountain men and died before anyone could force him to regret it. There was no congregation, just Clara and Silas and Levi and Margaret and Clem and Wren and an empty chair for Boone. Silas took Clara's hands, rough on rough, callous on callous, the hands of two people who had spent their lives holding things that tried to slip away and had finally found something worth gripping. "I give you all I have," he said. "These hands, this land, my name, my word. I can carry you when you are tired, and I will never leave." His voice did not shake. His eyes did not leave hers. Clara spoke. Her voice was clear as creek water. "I have known loss. I have known the kind of silence that fills your bones and makes you wonder if you will ever hear anything again. But with you, I hear life. I hear the fire in the morning, in the creek at night, and your boots on the porch when you come home. I am not afraid of the road ahead. I will walk it with you, and if I have to, I will carry you." Wren stepped forward. In his hands he held something small, a flower, purple, barely larger than a thumbnail. He had found it by the creek that morning, the first wildflower of spring, and pressed it between 2 squares of paper. He laid it between their joined hands. "Why the flower?" Wren Clara asked. The boy who had not spoken for 2 years and now carried words like precious things, choosing each one with the care of someone who understood their weight, looked up at her. "So we remember," he said, "the first good thing after winter." Clara could not speak. Silas knelt. Together they dug a small hole at the base of the cottonwood tree. They placed the flower inside. And beside it, Clara placed Rose Calhoun's letter. "Build something worth keeping." They covered them with earth and pressed the soil flat with their palms. A flower and a letter buried where a family began. Silas kissed Clara's forehead. She kissed his scarred jaw. And Wren, standing between them, looked up and asked the question that all children ask when the world changes shape around them. "Does this mean we are staying?" Alice lifted the boy into his arms, settled him on his hip the way he had seen Boone do 100 times, looked at Wren with eyes that were no longer tired, no longer haunted, no longer searching. "It means we are building," he said. 5 years passed. The cabin they built in Wind River Valley was larger than the one in Dead Man's Canyon. New walls, new rooms, a proper porch with posts that did not sag, and a cedar railing that Silas sanded smooth and that smelled sweet when the rain fell. The barn doubled. The fence line ran straight across the north ridge and down to the creek. The herd grew to 60 head. A chicken coop appeared, then a smokehouse, then a garden where Clara planted cabbage and carrots and the wildflowers she gathered from the creek bed every spring. Wren was 12. He had grown tall and lean and quick, with the kind of energy that reminded everyone of someone they could not name, but everyone knew. He followed Silas everywhere and copied everything from the way the man walked to the way he squinted at the horizon. He could split kindling without splintering it and carry 2 buckets without spilling a drop. He had developed a laugh loud and sudden and startling that came from some deep well of joy that Clara had not known existed in him. He called her Ma. He called Silas Pa. He kept the wooden horse on the shelf above his bed next to the medical texts Levi was teaching him to read. Clara and Silas had 2 children of their own. The first was a boy. They named him Boone. He was 4 years old with a grin that arrived before the rest of his face, a grin so familiar that the first time Clara saw it, she had to leave the room. He looked like his uncle, not in any way that genetics could explain, but in every way that love could. As if Boone Calhoun had decided that the best way to keep going was to come back as a small boy with dirty knees and a laugh that could shake pine needles from the trees. The second was a girl. They named her Rose. She was 2. Black-haired and loud and fearless, and born in the cabin with Levi attending his hands, as gentle and sure as they had ever been. She had Silas's amber eyes and Clara's stubbornness, and she had recently learned to say one word with perfect clarity. No, she said it to everything and everyone, including the dog. Levi lived on the ranch. Uncle Levi. He had not married. He did not seem to need to. He had a family. He taught Wren to identify herbs and dress wounds. He taught little Boone to count to 20 in Latin. He taught Rose nothing because Rose refused to be taught anything, which Levi said was the finest sign of intelligence he had ever observed. Clem Hadley still came each season. He brought his wife, now a quiet woman named Ada, and their son, a tow-headed boy of 4 who played with little Boone, and came home covered in mud and happiness. Clem no longer squinted at Clara. He greeted her with a nod that contained the entire history of a man who had been wrong about someone and had spent years being right about them instead. Margaret Bridwell still tucked extra sugar into Clara's grocery bag, still squeezed her hand across the counter, still said for the children with a wink that both of them understood. Prudence Whitmore had not spoken to Clara in 5 years. Clara did not mind. Some doors are better closed. Hollister's ranch had been divided and sold. Crane was long gone. Silver Creek had a new marshal. Fair, honest, the kind of man who looked people in the eye and meant it. On a warm evening in late spring of 1893, Clara stood at the cabin door and watched her children play in the yard. Wren chased little Boone around the woodpile while Rose sat in the dirt and lectured the dog about something the dog appeared to take very seriously. The sound of their voices carried across the clearing and mixed with the wind in the creek and the chickens and the thousand small sounds that make up a life. She reached out and touched the cottonwood tree they had planted from a seedling brought from Dead Man's Canyon. It had grown taller than the porch. Its roots went deep. Its branches spread wide enough to shade the front steps on a summer afternoon. Somewhere beneath it, in a tin box they had buried the day they moved in, were a pressed purple flower and a letter that said, "Build something worth keeping." Silas came up behind her. His arms circled her waist. His chin rested on her shoulder. He smelled of pine sap and leather and the sweet cedar of the porch railing he had just finished sanding. "You remember," she asked. He asked. He did not need to ask what. "The day you stepped off that train in Silver Creek, scared to death." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Clara would hold for the rest of her life. "You were not scared," he said. "You were brave." Scared and brave are not the same thing, but they live in the same house. Clara laughed, a full laugh, open and warm and unafraid. Not the controlled smile she had worn in the Ashford dining room, not the careful composure she had maintained while digging up bones. This was the laugh of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side with her hands full and her heart intact. Boone would have liked that line, she said. Silas almost smiled, the closest he ever came. Boone would have stolen it and told everyone it was his. They laughed together. And in the laughter, Boone was still there, in the grin of the 4-year-old boy who bore his name, in the wooden horse on Wren's shelf, in the empty chair they sat at the table every Christmas Eve, in the way Levi still sometimes paused in the middle of a task and looked toward the mountains as if he expected to hear a voice calling him from the ridge, a voice that was always laughing, because if it stopped laughing, it would have to feel what was underneath. Wren ran through the yard, 12 years old and fast and alive. He scooped up little Boone and swung him through the air, and the boy shrieked with joy, and Rose looked up from the dog and said, "No," which meant yes, which meant I want to turn. The wind moved through the valley. It stirred the grass and rustled the cottonwood leaves and carried the smell of earth and wildflowers and smoke from a chimney that stood straight and true. The sky was wide and the mountains were blue, and the road that Clara had traveled so long ago stretched empty in the distance, carrying no one, leading nowhere she needed to go. She was already home. Beneath the cottonwood tree in Wind River Valley, a flower and a letter were sleeping in the earth. Above them, branches spread wide and green. Above those, the sky was clean. No clouds, no storms gathering on the horizon, and not a single buzzard in sight.